Good. Okay, well, I'll share the results with you. Many of you are correct. So there are nearly, or between 6,000 and 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. And by some counts, there are up to 7,000 or more than 7,000 languages spoken in the world today and signed in the world today. But you know, we should be wary about these numbers because counting languages isn't an easy task. The counts that we have rely often on census data, and that census data may not be accurate. The degree of information that we have about languages varies from language to language. And also it can be difficult to determine what counts as a unique language versus a dialect of a language. So even if we did have an exact number, and there are some exact numbers proposed, that number itself would be in flux. Why? Well, because we're learning more and more about languages every day, and the languages themselves are undergoing change. Now, if we look at where those 6,000 to 7,000 languages are spoken, we see that linguistic diversity is unevenly spread throughout the world. So this chart here, for example, shows us the 10 countries where the most numbers of languages are spoken. And you see Papua New Guinea tops the list with over 800 languages. Places like the US, you see the number 335 here, about 2/3 of that number are languages that are indigenous to North America or to the United States. And the same is likely true of Australia as well. In terms of the percentage, I mean, of languages that are spoken there that are indigenous to that country. Now, not only is linguistic diversity unevenly spread geographically, it's also unevenly spread across speaker population. So 94% of the world's languages, and if we're saying that there are 7,000 languages in the world, that's about over 6,500 languages, they are spoken by only 6% of the world's population. Perhaps even more striking is the fact that about 1/4 of the world's languages have fewer than 1,000 speakers, and 10% of the world's languages have fewer than 100 speakers. And by the way, counting speakers is just as difficult as counting languages. Now, we can also talk about linguistic diversity in terms of how languages are related to each other. So in linguistics, we talk about language families. So those 7,000 languages of the world that are spoken in the world can be grouped into around 420 language families. And there are some differences in how these, in the reporting of these numbers. By some counts, more than 1/3 of those 420 language families are language families with only a single member. And those languages are called isolates. And by that, we mean they are languages that have no genetic relationship to any other languages. And so some of you may know the language Kootenai, spoken here in Montana. That language is considered a language isolate with no genetic relationship to any other language. Now, linguistic diversity is threatened. Languages across the world are in danger of disappearing. And so by that, we mean that there are languages that may cease to be spoken in the future, in the near future. And in some cases, those languages may cease to be spoken before anything is documented about those languages or before we record anything about those languages. So let's take another quick poll. And this question is, approximately what percentage of the world's languages do you think are endangered? I'll give you a few seconds to answer. Okay. All right, I'm gonna stop the poll and I'll share the results. So we got a few different answers here. I'm gonna stop sharing and tell you that if you said 45%, you are correct. Nearly half of the world's languages are endangered, and by some counts, a much higher percentage is endangered. So if we look at regions across the world, we see that in the Americas, by some counts, we have 1,059 living languages, 645 of which are endangered. If we look at Europe, 289 living languages, 123 of which are endangered. In Africa, 2,140 living languages, 502 of which are endangered. In Asia, 2,306 living languages, 1,072 of which are endangered. And in the Pacific, I gotta move your faces here, 1,323 living languages, 584 of which are endangered. Now, we should really keep in mind that not only are these languages in flux, and the reporting of these languages may vary from year to year, again, as we learn more about languages and as those languages change and may enter into different categories of endangerment or vitality, but also that these are just a set of numbers reported by one organization. Other organizations may report slightly different numbers depending also on the kind of information they are taking into account. So how do these languages become endangered? Well, there isn't a single reason why languages across the world become endangered, but there are a variety of factors that do point to why languages undergo endangerment and loss. Natural catastrophes such as tsunamis or earthquakes or volcanoes, they can lead to language endangerment and loss. Remember, some of these languages are spoken by a very small number of speakers, and natural catastrophes can have serious impacts on those communities. War, genocide, famine, displacement of communities is also a cause that leads to language endangerment. Perhaps more common across the world is also pressures from a dominant group to assimilate. That is forced or sometimes voluntary loss of language or giving up a language in order to assimilate to the dominant group. And that pressure often involves the loss of cultural and ethnic identity as well. And then fewer opportunities to use a language can also lead a language to be further marginalized. So why should we care about language endangerment and the threat to linguistic diversity? Well, because linguistic diversity matters. So why does linguistic diversity matter? Well, language is a form of identity. Language is how we connect to our community or communities and the world around us. Language is also a human right, which is enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in Article 2, which states that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. UNESCO also classifies language as an expression of cultural heritage. So they state that languages, with their complex implications for identity, communication, social integration, education, and development, are of strategic importance for people and the planet. When languages fade, so too does the world's rich tapestry of cultural diversity. Language is also a key to understanding the human mind. So our understanding of human cognition is dependent on an understanding of what is and what is not possible in a human language. That in turn helps us to understand how children can acquire such complex linguistic systems easily and fairly quickly. Linguistic diversity also contributes to a vibrant world. And as David Crystal suggests, if diversity is a prerequisite for successful humanity, then the preservation of linguistic diversity is essential, for language lies at the heart of what it means to be human. Now, the good news is that linguistic diversity can be protected. So all over the world, in a variety of different ways, people are engaged in activities to protect linguistic diversity and preserve linguistic diversity. So linguists often in collaboration with communities and with researchers from other disciplines, and a number of different types of individuals document languages in order to learn as much as possible about these languages, their forms, their functions, their values. Now, when you document a language, you also are involved in audio and video recording speakers of that language, using that language in a variety of different contexts. And those recordings can then be archived so that communities as well as researchers can access those materials and use those materials in different ways. One of the many ways one might use those archived materials is in language revitalization. So language revitalization is often defined as the process of attempting to bring languages that have undergone some reduction in use back to an increased level of use within their communities and sometimes beyond. Now, language revitalization involves many different components. These photos here just show a small selection of the ways that communities have engaged in this work. It often involves language teaching, but not solely language teaching. That happens in the classroom, outside of the classroom. There's a great focus on children, teaching language to children, but also to adults. And it often incorporates cultural knowledge and cultural activities. But it's by no means limited to these activities. This is just a small indication of some of the work that goes into language revitalization. Protecting linguistic diversity also means supporting multilingualism through policies, resources, increased opportunities. And raising awareness and becoming informed is also essential, are also essential components of protecting linguistic diversity. Now, so far we've been focusing our attention primarily on the way diversity is reflected in different languages. But linguistic diversity is also reflected in dialect variation. Now, you might think about a dialect as different ways of pronouncing certain words. So for example, if I show you this word, you might be aware that some people pronounce this word crick and some people pronounce this word creek. You might also think of dialects as being different words for the same thing. For example, whether or not you call a sweetened carbonated beverage a pop or a soda or a Coke. But the term dialect actually refers not just to the pronunciation of words and the use of particular words, but every part of the language, right? Words, phrases, sentences, meanings, all are a part of our understanding of what a dialect is. Dialects can vary by region, by ethnicity, by social status, by gender, and dialects, like languages, are part of our identity. Now, unfortunately, some dialects are subject to very intense critique. So this sentence, for example, I ain't leaving. These features of language are mistakenly taken to be errors instead of what they actually are, which are systematic, rule-governed patterns that just happen to be spoken in less favorable dialects, less socially favored dialects. So this, I would say, is yet another way that linguistic diversity can be threatened. So if I showed you these two pictures and I asked you which of these birds is flying correctly, you might think that's a very strange question, and I would too. So why? Why is this such a strange question to ask? Well, because each bird flies the way it does. Neither way is more correct than the other. Each way works for that bird. So why is it problematic then to talk about correctness when we're talking about different dialects? Well, that's because every dialect works for its speakers. And if it didn't, we wouldn't be able to communicate with one another in that dialect. So linguistic diversity is protected when linguistic diversity, and by that we mean diversity of languages as well as diversity of dialects, is appreciated and promoted. So I want to leave you with a few final thoughts, but just before I do, let us take one last poll. So question 3, who can appreciate and promote linguistic diversity? I'm going to end that poll and share with you, indeed, everyone can. So every answer here is correct. But in particular, it is important that we understand that we all can appreciate and promote linguistic diversity. Languages and dialects don't have to be replaced. It's really a misunderstanding to think that. Linguist Rosina Lippi-Green suggests that when an individual is asked to reject their own language or dialect, they are being asked to drop allegiances to the people and places that define them. They are being asked to suppress or deny the most effective way they have of situating themselves socially in the world. So instead, languages and dialects can flourish alongside one another. Essentially, everyone can celebrate linguistic diversity. Some of you are already doing that. You are here at DiverseU, becoming better informed. You may be learning a second language or a third language. You may already be engaged in some form of language documentation or revitalization or supporting others who are doing this sort of work. But I hear you say, Leora, I don't have time to learn another language. I can't fit that into my schedule. I don't have time to become a linguist. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. I can't go to Papua New Guinea or Brazil or Ghana to document endangered languages there. Well, to you, I would also say there are still other ways that you can celebrate linguistic diversity. So we can learn not just to speak languages, we can learn about languages. We can change our attitudes towards linguistic diversity. We can embrace the similarities and differences in the way we all speak. We can try to speak up when we see or hear linguistic diversity being threatened. We can also spread the word about linguistic diversity and why it matters. So in a sense, we can all share the responsibility of protecting and celebrating linguistic diversity. And with that, I say thanks so much.
Yay!
Thank you.
Any questions for Leora?
I have more of a comment or I guess experience. And I grew up with family that uses dialect that I don't. And in my head, I guess maybe one side of, like my father's side does not use that kind of slang. And my grandmother viewed it as lazy on one side. And I don't know, I just picked that up subconsciously. I've never used even the language my mother uses or the words, except when I moved to Montana. I did have some words that stood out, and people here, I came from Denver, Colorado, people here in my past had mentioned a little bit about some of the words I use, and one was refrigerator in particular, and it was a person I worked with, and he would laugh. He's like, that is a very ignorant word, don't use that, it makes you look very ignorant. And I'm like, my sweet little grandmother always called the refrigerator a refrigerator, and he said it's either fridge or refrigerator. And that's always stuck with me. I actually say that word more because it made me mad, because it was part of how I grew up. So then I started looking at how I judge the rest of the language that my mother kind of uses, or even one of my daughters. I used to scold my daughter to speak more clearly, not use the word ask, but ask, because I just don't understand it, but it's through information like this over time, asking somebody to drop what makes them them and what made their family composition what it was, or their culture is really kind of terrible. So this is like really a great, I guess, backup for that thinking, to keep continuing to quit judging other people's languages in my past. So thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that. I unfortunately think that your story is not unique, but I think the more and more we can talk about these things and recognize what this is for what it is, which is a form of discrimination that seems to still be socially acceptable. And so that is what we are hoping to change. So thank you very much for sharing.
I can just say that I have lived in the Missoula Valley for 28 years, and this past year I took a course that was offered. It was just,
dude, where is it?
what? I was just so it was a course that was offered, and it was just a 2-hour course, and it was on Salish language, and it was so great. And for non-visual people here, I'm white. It was so great to be introduced to not only just the Salish language a little bit, but to see that what Leora says is so correct. You know, it was the language was so entwined with this valley, and even though I had lived here for so long, it totally opened my eyes to a whole different way of looking at these surroundings that I thought I knew so well, just by taking this 2-hour language class.
I guess I could, oh, sorry, do you want to go ahead?
I was just going to say thank you for sharing that, Beth. I appreciate it. Please go ahead.
I guess, well, I was watching this presentation. I'm a journalism student, and I was thinking about how basically journalists have basically defined a default dialect, in the sense that every paper in America, at least, has to be written with the same words for things, like the same grammar, the same rules. And TV broadcasters, like, there's a reason that every TV broadcaster sounds the same. It's a deliberately so-called neutral accent and neutral way of talking. And it made me think about how, like, we have these grammar rules and, like, rules of speaking in certain professions that we see as the default. And I think that that's really interesting, how even something like how, even something like, for journalists, even something like how you choose to write down your information can potentially be alienating to a bunch of the people you're trying to speak to. And so that's definitely something I'm going to be thinking about going forward. I also had a bit of a question. While I was looking at your staff page, I noticed that you did some work with Montana English, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that, because that sounded really interesting. I never really thought about Montana like having its own dialect.
Thank you very much for your comment, and as well as your question. So, and I have just I don't want to keep people beyond the set time, so let me just say really briefly that when we think about everybody who speaks a dialect, right? So it's just not possible to speak without speaking a dialect. Again, this is a different way of thinking about dialect. And so there are a lot of projects that look at the way that dialects vary across, for example, the US. And so there are maps that are generated that show the sort of dividing lines between the different dialect areas. And it turns out that a lot of that research we see a lot more of the variation identified in the East and much less in the West. So in older studies of dialect variation in North America, or in the US in particular, also in Canada as well, the West was considered a dialect area that included 11 states. And it was sort of defined by the fact that it was not very homogeneous. And it was because not a lot of work had been done to understand what was happening in terms of the way that people speak in the West. And then more recently, there's been a lot more work to sort of try to identify what is it that is unique to different places in the West? And so Montana, probably because of, by virtue of it not having a lot of, a very low population and not a lot of linguists here yet, did not get a lot of attention in the dialectology literature. It was either overlooked or not much research was done. And given the fact that we have so many people who are on different sides of the continental divide, in different areas, there's a lot of work to sort of be done. And so when looking at dialect variation within Montana, the idea is to try to document the variation in this state and also to understand where Montana fits into this larger map of North America. And there's some really fabulous work that is being done in the area of particularly English dialect variation in the United States, but not solely English variation. Thank you for your question. And I recognize that some folks have to leave, and I don't want people to feel trapped in this Zoom room. So I can stay on for a few more minutes, but I just also want to say thank you to everybody who came today.
Thanks, Leora. Emma, did you have a question?
I was just wondering, is this the whole Zoom session, is this being recorded and going to be posted somewhere where we can look at it for future reference?
It is.
Okay, great.
Yes. Yes.
That's
It
great.
will be, if you, oh, go ahead, Leora.
No, I was also going to say that, and if you guys have follow-up questions or want to talk more about these topics, you can also reach out to me individually. But sorry,
Okay.
Haley.
Thank you.
You're totally fine. Yes, they will be posted. I'm just still trying, to be honest, I'm still trying to figure out the best way to post all of them because we have about 30 plus, almost hour-long sessions. So if you follow DiverseU on Facebook and the University Center on Facebook, that's where we'll probably either post them there or we'll post links to like a box folder or YouTube. Yes,
Okay.
maybe a YouTube channel, Daisy says. I think you might be right, Daisy.
All right, thank you.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate your comments and being here.